Welcome to our Rewind Roundtable. Tonight we are turning the clocks all the way back to 1993 and the iconic Norris Division semifinals between the Toronto Maple Leafs and the Detroit Red Wings. We're going to be picking it up at game number 3. And to break it all down, we've got Joe Bowen, we got Paul Hendrick, and Bob McGill. But before we dive into this matchup, we quickly want to say thank you to all of the frontline workers, the healthcare providers that are continuing to work tirelessly to keep us safe. And for those of you that are continuing to physically distance, thank you for what you're doing. It does not go unnoticed, and we are going to continue to get through this together. And because we are all physically distancing, we are doing this show from the comfort of our own homes. So, gentlemen, I have to ask you, how have you been? Henny, I'll start with you because the last time we saw each other, we were at Scotiabank Arena. We were getting ready for morning skate, and my, how quickly things have changed.
Yeah, and how naive, I think, back then, Danielle, 5+ weeks ago that we were, and things really have evolved since then. But you know what? I've picked up on Spanish lessons. I'm into that every day. I walk my mother's dog mostly every day as well. She's 87 years of age. And I'm getting reacquainted with my wife. I think in the last 25 years of what we've been able to do, my wife and I have been 8.5 years apart when you think of all the traveling we do. And as good as that has been, I'll be honest, I really miss you guys.
Bob, what about you? I see you're up at the cottage.
Yes, it's funny. I got all my yard work is all done. I'm ready for, what's going to transpire, I guess, here if the weather continues to stay nice. And for the first time ever with my yard work done, I never got one mosquito bite or black fly bite. So it's a good thing.
Joe, I know you like to read a lot of books. How many books have you read in the last few weeks?
Well, a couple on the Civil War. I'm reading the book on John Brophy right now, and a young man over here to my right, Mr. McGill, is a prominent part in it. But we've been busy with Participation House here in Markham. Gang, my son, his brother-in-law, Liam's brother-in-law is Bobby Goodwin, who has had cerebral palsy for all of his 27 years. It's a real tough situation in there. A lot of the staff walked off, and good friends, Doc Biggerstaff, who was a homicide detective in Toronto, and his young son, Jack, when they were walking out, they were walking in. And they've been there for the last couple of weeks, and Jen Goodwin, Bobby Goodwin's aunt, has been in there as well. So we're trying to help out with raising some money and getting some help for those people doing the work at the front, as it were.
That's fantastic, Joe. I have to admit, in my spare time, I could probably add hairstylist to my resume. My husband's hair. I watched a video on Instagram. It was a little tutorial of how you could trim your hair, not particularly style it, and I convinced him that I could do an excellent job. So he entrusted me.
So is he right down to the wood like me now?
No, but it probably should get to that because one side is a little bit faded more than the other side. So thankfully he doesn't have to go out in public anytime soon.
Well, at least we get a chance to look back now on this great series. And I can't believe, Danielle, how quickly time has flown by. But you think back to that time, and Toronto opened that season with 10 consecutive victories, lost amongst the Blue Jays' quest for a second consecutive World Series. And then the playoffs beginning, Chicago in first place in the Norris, Detroit in second, Toronto third, St. Louis a distant fourth, and in just the overwhelming odds against the Leafs. But as overwhelming as they might have been, Toronto had 99 points, Detroit had 103. And I think the important thing, Joe and Bob, the Leafs could score goals. They had 3 Hall of Famers in their lineup. Detroit had 6, mind you. But Toronto, the second lowest goals scored against in the entire league. And I think that basis of that defense, Bob, which included you, although not in this series because of injury, I think it was the foundation piece that really propelled them and the guys up front. I love that defensive pairings, all 3 of them, and just the stability, Joe, that they brought.
Well, no question about it. First, and you got Sylvain Lefebvre and Bob Rouse, Dave Ellett playing along with Jamie McCowan. And then, your other guys you could sprinkle in and out with Dmitry Mironov, Todd Gill, and a couple other different guys in and out of the lineup all year long. But the backbone, obviously, in the last line of defense really was Felix Potvin. But the defensive core, no question about it, along with Pat Burns, who came in and cracked the whip from day one of training camp and talked about playing without the puck. And being responsible, and the less time you spend in your own end, the more time you'll have in the opposition's end of the ice, I think really sunk in with the group. And as a result, defensively, we were a very good hockey club, and a big reason why it was such a terrific run.
I think one of the things too, guys, is that there was no Norris Trophy winner on that group, but Pat Burns many times said that as a group, it was probably the best defense core in the National Hockey League. And, the Norris Trophy historically has gone to defensemen who have put up big offensive numbers. Well, Roy Hobbs, a.k.a. Dave Ellett, was really the only one that was there to put numbers up from the back end. Todd Gill had a good season offensively. But overall, I think, Henny, the one thing that they had going was, as a group, they were extremely capable, and Felix Potvin obviously had a big part in that as well.
I was looking at the numbers, Danielle. 4 of those top 6 guys in terms of the D we mentioned all went on to play 1,000 plus games in the National Hockey League. Sly Lefebvre, Bob mentioned, he was at 945. Mironov was in about 550 games. So you just look at those top 5 guys and just the experience they had in their National Hockey League careers, and this was en route to the end of those careers when they were in Toronto. It was a veteran group, and like I said, they didn't give up much. Dino Ciccarelli in this series tried to do what he would have liked to have done, but there wasn't a lot of time and space. Steve Yzerman had pretty good games in games 1 and 2. He didn't get a point in games 3, 4, or 5, and as the series shifted back to Toronto, Maple Leaf Gardens seeing a playoff game for the first time in 3 years. Joe, the atmosphere had to be just electric back then on that particular night for Game 3.
Well, I think the one thing too, Henny, was that the fact after the first 2 losses, I think the guys came back saying, we can't get embarrassed here. They'd given up, you talked about how good defensively they were. Well, they'd given up 12 goals in 2 games. And the situation with Ciccarelli was interesting, I think, Bob, and maybe you could shed a little more light on this. And this fracas that we're seeing was initially touched off by Ciccarelli being there. But when they came back to Toronto, they decided, instead of battling with him in front of the net, let him stand there and front him. Block shots. Don't let things get to him. Instead of tangling with him and then getting involved with Potvin because of the fracas going on in front. And it had a big-time impact on the remainder of this series.
No question about it, Joe. And I think it's right. After giving up 6 goals in each of the first 2 games in Detroit, we collectively as a group, in the day before game number 3, talked about, hey, we got to leave Ciccarelli, let him get his space, but we got to stay out in front of him and see if Potvin can see pucks. But we can't get off of our game. That's exactly what he wanted. He wanted everybody to pay attention to him and lose composure with your job at hand. And let's get back to work as a group. And obviously here in game number 3, going out and scoring the first couple of goals of the hockey game sets the tone. And I think, Paul, you said it best as well, too, that people in Toronto hadn't seen a home playoff game in a couple of years. And, boy, were they ready for something when you've got a team that had a team record 99 points and found themselves in an 0-2 hole coming home for game number 3. They were ready to explode as they were expecting that this team was better than what they showed in those first couple of hockey games.
How difficult was that for you, Bob? Watching from the sidelines, you had broken your jaw in March. Was that a difficult time to be the cheerleader from the sidelines, knowing that you couldn't truly contribute?
Well, it was pretty disheartening because obviously, playing against the Red Wings, Pat Burns had talked to me, probably, in February sometime, talking about, coming down the stretch, you're going to get an opportunity to play some more. But we're thinking towards, geez, if we play Chicago or Detroit in that first round of the playoffs, we could certainly use your toughness in that series. And obviously not being able to play was disheartening without question. But it was one of those things where, it's such a great group. When you look at a 99 record for the Toronto Maple Leafs, 99 points that year, you knew that this team was special and was capable of good things. But not being able to play was hard to sit back and watch, especially when you found the club down 0-2 going into game number 3.
One other thing too, and I'll jump in here too, and I certainly echo that sentiment with Bob, and physicality of this series. Kosher and Probert, all kinds of toughness on the other side. Yeah. One of the toughest things that we're going to see in this series is the smallest guy maybe on the team. Nicky Borishevsky played in game 1 and fractured his orbital bone. And I went through my book, and the things that you forget over the time, guys and gal, is that I completely forgot that Nicky wasn't there for games 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and comes back in game 7 wearing a shield, and then played the remainder of the next 2 rounds that also went 7 games. And he was an integral part of this team because he had been drafted as a 28-year-old rookie, came over, spoke zero English. Dmitry Mironov, I always said, looked like he had just been sent over by the KGB because he was always dour and wouldn't talk and whatnot. He was always very serious. Nicky was like the crown prince. He was running around and laughing and trying to have fun and trying to learn the language, and put up 38 goals and was third on this team in scoring. And so when they come back to Toronto, that first line that usually had Gilmour, Andreychuk, and Borishevsky on it, all of a sudden now it becomes a mix master. I mean, Pat Burns is pulling names out of the hat to play on the wing with Dougie and Andreychuk, and he does a masterful job. And I think as you watch game 3, watch how many different people are on the ice playing with Gilmour and Andreychuk, waiting for Borishevsky to come back. And I suppose we have to say, thank God he made it back for game 7.
And I guess replacing Borishevsky with a future Hall of Famer and Glenn Anderson wasn't bad. And as good as that top line was, I've got to go back to the Zezel, Berg, and of course Osborne line. And Zezel, Joe and Bob, and what he was able to do in the face-off circle, and of course a former pro soccer player, able to kick that puck back, and just his strength as he went head-to-head often with Steve Yzerman, especially in those important defensive zone draws. What a player. And you talk about strength up the middle. That line wasn't necessarily known for its scoring, although they could score goals, but they did a lot of other things. In the D-zone draws and the penalty kill and all that went with it, equally as important as what we saw from Andreychuk and his group and what they were able to do as well.
Well, you're right about that. And, you think of Peter Zezel and the experience factor again. Those years he spent in Philadelphia, a couple of Stanley Cup final appearances with the Flyers, and those valuable, experienced guys, in big parts when it comes to a playoff series. Peter Zezel was certainly front and center, as you said, but that line was dominant as far as checking, but they came up with some massive goals throughout the course of the playoffs, no question.
And the best part about that was that Pat Burns wouldn't have known Mr. Berg if he'd driven over him in a bus. And that was a mid-season acquisition by General Manager Cliff Fletcher. And Bergie was one of the great guys of getting underneath people's skins. He wasn't overly tough, I don't think, Bob. He didn't fight unless he really had to. But he was an enormous thorn in the side. And that whole line, and that's another key part to this series, in that when you came home for game 3, Burns was able to get the last change. And so Yzerman got a real big-time dose of Berg, Osborne, and Zezel in the first 2 games that were played at home. The games in Detroit, not so much. So coming home and having last change, I think, had a big part in that. But you're right about that, Paul. Those 3 guys were something else. And Bergie was just, he had He was underneath everybody's skin. He was inside everybody else's jersey.
I mean, the thing about Billy Berg, there's a guy that, he was a defenseman by trade, was turned into a forward, and obviously a pretty sharp guy. But his skating ability set him apart. And I think that was the big reason where he'd get in. And, back in those days, you could have 3 steamboats after a guy made a pass and you could finish your check. And Bergie was the master at that. And boy, he would get under the skin of the opposition, no question, and just frustrate the heck out of people. And he was certainly an integral part of that line, no question.
Speaking of getting under the skin of the opponents, Pat Burns had said to Wendell Clark, the captain of the team, don't engage in any fighting with Dino Ciccarelli, anyone, Bob Probert, anyone on the Detroit Red Wings. And yet Wendell had such an ability to change the entire dynamic of a game. But he was heavily scrutinized by the media. And you don't really think about that in the early 90s. I mean, now seeing the Toronto Maple Leafs in this era, there's social media, there's so much external pressure. But going back to that series, how do you think Wendell dealt with it all?
Wendell was called Wendy after the first 2 games. And for someone to do that, I mean, that elevated his game dramatically. I mean, he was a physical force. The Leafs he'd gone long stretches without scoring, but in the playoffs, he rose to another occasion. I think he'd gone 9 games without a goal coming into the postseason. Wendell Clark was one of the premier leaders of this franchise while he was wearing a blue and white jersey. And in this playoff round, he was absolutely unbelievable.
Well, the thing about Wendell is that, when you need him to step up to the forefront and show that leadership ability, and, if you ever doubted his ability to take the bull by the horn and lead the way, he certainly did it again in this playoff run. And you're right about that. He had a tough go heading into the playoffs where he hadn't scored in 8 or 9 games. But getting going here and scoring that big goal in this game number 3 to really get things going for the hockey club made a huge difference. And I think the weight of the world off his shoulders, and a big reason for him to have, and the hockey club to have, such a terrific run as we did.
And we're going to see in Game 4, Leafs Wings tied 2-2, I think, third period. Glenn Anderson with a big check, and then following that, it was Wendell Clark on Bob Probert, stood him up right at center ice and knocked him on his backside. Got the crowd fueled up, got the Leafs fueled up. Toronto goes on to score 2 more goals and wins Game 4 to send it back to Joe Louis Arena 2 nights later, tied up at 2 games apiece. So you talk about the scoring and the drought coming in, but the physicality, the leadership. He had the C on his left shoulder. He brought it each and every night. It's the way he played. It's the reason why his career obviously didn't last as long as we would have liked it to, but it's also a reason why his banners hung high at Scotiabank Arena, and of course, a legitimate member alongside the Legends Row. That's Wendell.
Another player that really came alive in Game 3 was Dave Anderchuk. And this is a player that also received criticism that he wasn't one of those performers in the postseason. And yet he was a big reason why the Maple Leafs were able to come out of that 2-0 deficit in this series.
Bobby, I'm going to start here, and then you can probably chime in, because one thing I always remember about Dave Andreychuk is that he was not like a first pick overall because he couldn't skate. He wasn't a very good skater. But his size and his eye-hand coordination in front of the net was unbelievable. Just a small story. He brought with him everywhere his measuring stick. I don't know if you remember this, Bob. He had one stick that was the exact size that he wanted all of his other sticks to be. Never used it in a game. It was the measuring stick.
Yep.
He might cut off a 1/16 of an inch from the other sticks to get it down to where the measuring stick was. So everything had to be just so. But he would drive Felix Potvin absolutely crazy after practice because he'd stay out there till the cows came home tipping pucks if they would let him. And boy, he and Doug Gilmour were just a tremendous duo, but it was a lot of hard work that got it there.
Yeah, you're right, Joe. And, he came to the Leafs in that trade for Grant Fuhr with the Buffalo Sabres. 25 goals in 31 games. I'd say he made an instant impact on the hockey club. But getting back to that hand-eye coordination, I don't think I played with anybody who could tip pucks like Dave Andrechuk. And I remember one day in practice at Maple Leaf Gardens, he broke his stick. And the blade broke off. There was about maybe this much from the heel left on the blade. And he said, line up. I was probably about 10 feet inside the blue line. He said, line up 10 pucks, and I want you to slap them as hard as you can. Anywhere in the net, and he was standing in front. He deflected all 10 of them with that little piece of blade on his stick. And like guys were watching, it was like they were just flabbergasted at how the hand-eye coordination that he had. But amazing, player, no question, certainly in the Hall of Fame today because of what his entire career. But he made such a huge impact with the Maple Leafs, no question.
And Danielle, the wingspan was so impressive, and he just had to set himself up within a few feet of the office, and guys would get it there, and he'd find a way to put it in. But I think games 4 and 5, guys, we remember well, he also scored a couple of goals off the rush. So although his skating may have been critiqued, he was able to come in with that big frame flying. And I remember one of the shots, I think in Detroit, dumped in off the boards, and he comes in and just top of the circle and beats Tim Shovelday. He was able to score in many, many ways. It's why he's in the Hall of Fame, but he was so hard to handle. And Nick Lidstrom in that particular series, just a second-year player, but what a learning experience it was for that future Hall of Fame player to have to try to handle Dave Andrechuk. He just wasn't physically strong enough to do it.
And just Doug Gilmour, I mean, earlier on, Joe, you were talking about it, the line combinations that Pat Burns was throwing out there. Dougie was double shifting. He played a ton of minutes. He was taking a beating out there. They were slashing him. They were hacking him. Like, how is he able to persevere through all of this and still be as productive as he was?
Well, I mean, he was on intravenous between games and sometimes maybe between periods. Just an amazing athlete and an amazing work ethic and an amazing compete level. And you're right, the forward line was Gilmour and you two other guys, whoever's ready to go, but you're going on next shift. I mean, he was double shifted, triple shifted. He played in all different situations, and he had just an absolutely magnificent season. In his first full year in Toronto. He had arrived, obviously, the year before and almost got the Leafs into the playoffs. The lockouts, or the strike, I guess it was at that point, I think deprived them of that. But he and Andrechuk, once Andrechuk got here after the big trade that sent Grant Fuhrer to Buffalo, became just inseparable on the ice. And then little Nicky was there and Glenn Anderson was there, but it was Gilmour's really using the straw to stir the drink, I guess, Bobby.
Well, I'll tell you, I played with a lot of good players in my career, but Dougie Gilmour, when I see that season that he had, 127 points, which is the record for the Toronto Maple Leafs. But more than anything, that playoff run, 3 7-game series, and it's not like today's NHL where there's travel breaks and all these different situations. There was 21 games in 42 days. It was a game every second day. That was just the way the schedule worked. There was no worrying about television, days off for in between games and things like that. And I can remember him stepping on the scale a few days, and he was like 160 pounds. And I'll tell you, he played like he was 225 pounds. Ferocious, no question, and unbelievable. The nickname Killer. He earned that without question. And I'll tell you, what an unbelievable player and what an unbelievable playoff run that was.
Well, gentlemen, this has been so much fun to take a trip down memory lane, relive some of these moments. So before we leave it on our Game 3 rewind, any final thoughts?
For me, I'm just going to elaborate on what Bob said, and the numbers that stick out for me for Doug Gilmour: 238 penalty minutes in the 2 regular seasons from 90 through to 94, and 63 playoff points in 39 career games with the Leafs. He epitomized blue and white, much like Wendell and the rest of those guys did. This was a team.
to fall in love with Harry Neal and Bob Cole all over again. Games that I've not watched in their entirety. And tonight, when you watch Game 3, listen to the crowd. The Gardens was just electric.
Well, guys, thank you so much for being a part of our Rewind Roundtable. You can catch this game, Toronto Maple Leafs, Detroit Red Wings, Game 3 of the Norris Division semifinals. Puck drop 8 o'clock. And make sure you join us next Tuesday. We're going to have a very special guest. The legendary Wendell Clark will be joining us to break down Game 4 of this series. In the meantime, thank you once again to all of our frontline workers that are out there keeping us safe. And for those of you at home, physically distancing, stay well, stay safe, and we will see you soon.